Welcome to Data Skeptic All About Surveys, our season about survey design, interpretation, and methodology. Let your voice be heard at survey.dataskeptic.com. Let's do some survey results to kick off this episode. Thanks to the listeners who have shared their thoughts by visiting survey.dataskeptic.com. After that onboarding survey, go on and click Take More Surveys. See the results, that's interesting, but take a few more. They're always short and somewhat informative, and I'm going to share a few insights with you here. The two newest surveys I've launched, which the least amount of you have taken just given their age, are the Programming Survey and the Cars Survey. Let's start with Cars because I find it a little bit more boring, mainly because I probably didn't build the most interesting survey in the world. But Linda and I have been having some car trouble, and we're shortly going to be in the market for something new. Most of you have had your vehicle for on average 5.6 years, the max only being 12 years. And I'll go ahead and de-anonymize myself, that was me. Linda and I have made the 2008 Prius work all this time. I guess there's no classic car owners in the listening audience. In fact, somebody beat me on year of manufacture. We go from 2004 to 2023 in the years. Average being 2014. Mostly Toyotas. Within that, a pretty good selection. And when I ask some details about when you use the vehicle, overwhelmingly people use their vehicles on weekdays and weekends. Unlike me, I use it about 1 to 2 days per week. Now, if you're looking at the results like I am at survey.dataskeptic.com after having taken this survey, you will see my embarrassment at a terrible way of displaying this integer response I've built so far. We've shown the mean, min, and max, but in this question where I asked, how many miles do you drive per year, put -1 if you have no idea, because I honestly have no idea. I can imagine most of you don't either. Maybe if you're doing the tax deduction. But of course, -1 is the minimum. Who knows how that destroys the mean? I gotta get in there and recode this. I think instead, integers should really show us the distribution. So maybe some sort of histogram or something like that. Hopefully, if you're listening to this in the future, I've already fixed it. Then I asked, how many miles per gallon do you achieve? To which someone, I don't know if they're fooling with me or trying to prove a point, but they put 1 million. That's the max. Actually, that's probably someone who has a fully electric car. And what the heck do you put? Because I know I don't let you type infinity in that blank. So that's a survey design issue I need to think more about. Overall, most people are satisfied or very satisfied with their vehicle, and somewhat or very likely to purchase the same make and model in the future as the most popular answers there. Although that's a fickle question too. You could like your car but not want to buy it again because there's a newer version of it, a newer replacement line, if you will. So my question doesn't account for that, or at least we can't get insight about that the way I've worded it. All right, let's move on to the programming survey. You are almost 3-to-1 Python over R users. Other being the third most likely category. That surprises me a little bit. But Python and R number 1 and number 2, could have guessed that. How many hours per week do you spend programming? Mean average 20.9. How many years have you been programming? Mean average of 15. Although despite that, the most popular answer to which best describes you, expert, intermediate, or novice programmer, intermediate is the largest choice. That seems a bit humble if the average year's programming is 15. I asked, do you use serverless design patterns? Which I'm a big fan of, but they don't work in all situations. In fact, often for someone doing machine learning, they're not exactly the right choice. Yet despite that, answers always, sometimes, and never. Sometimes most popular, never close behind, and always trailing in third. Lastly, I asked, where do you write your code? Example, Visual Studio's, IntelliJ, Vim. I see a lot of VS Code and Jupyter Notebooks, no surprises there, some Root, some RStudio, PyCharm. I made this free text because I didn't want to restrict anybody, but now I can't make a nice bar chart because it's whatever you guys typed in unless I manually code these. Or maybe I should use BERT to code these. Let me put some thought into that and get back to you guys. In the meantime, let's move on to our interview for today. How many of you have participated in a hackathon of some form? There weren't a lot of these when I was an undergrad, but I think it's becoming more and more popular. I've served as the judge at DataFest a few times over at UCLA. And the use case we discussed today is a survey that went out to some, not DataFest, but other hackathon participants. But the hackathon's really secondary. This is about an experiment around response rates. Ideally, everyone would respond to your survey, but we know that won't happen. So, in what case can we entice them? Offering them cash is not really an option if there's no budget for that. It also creates some perverse incentives, although that's a topic for another episode. Now, today we investigate, can something about the email alone make people more likely to respond? And if so, could those responses be biased in some way? We'll get to the bottom of both questions and a few other good ones right after this.
I'm Alexander Nolte. I'm an associate professor at the University of Tartu in Estonia and an adjunct associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh in the US.
Could you tell us a little bit about the types of research you work on?
Most of the work that I'm doing is really around collaboration in very different forms. So I work with companies to study work teams. I work with people that run hackathons and similar styles, sort of event-based collaborations. So anything where people work together, that basically gets me interested and excited.
And what sorts of methodologies do you use? I mean, graphs come to mind because they describe social networks, but I don't want to presume that's the right data structure. What kind of analytical tools do you apply?
Actually, I'm come more from a sort of qualitative tradition. So a lot of the things that I do focus sort of on qualitative research, and that includes interviews, observations, surveys, stuff like that. But then, in addition, of course, as you said, if we have data traces available, that's always great. So we can sort of trace, what's going on during collaboration or what happens afterwards, even. And we've done a lot of work around that as well. But in general, I would say I'm more a qualitative guy than I am a quantitative guy.
You'd mentioned the use of surveys. Could you expand on how they can be a good measurement tool in your work?
First of all, should say that most of the work that I do is really mixed method stuff. So it's very rare that I just employ one survey or that I just employ interviews. It's very often that these instruments are sort of combined with each other. And that being said, for me, surveys oftentimes help to, number one, get a grasp of a bigger population. Because let's say I want to study a hackathon, what happens often is you want to study the teams that participate because it's inevitably a sort of team-based event. And you can't really observe a ton of different teams at the same time because just of, manpower limitations basically. And also doing interviews afterwards, also you can only run with a sort of limited amount of people. So if you want a better grasp of, I don't know, let's say what were the overall motivations for people to participate in an event, then you can do that with a survey. And that's how I really employ these kinds of instrumentation.
Well, there's a couple of metrics to look at if you're going to share a survey like that. I guess, how do you get in touch with the people who participated in the hackathon, and what are some good benchmarks for measuring if you're getting in touch with them?
First of all, I should differentiate between in-person and online events
Mm-hmm.
because for in-person events, what we actually do quite often is we just walk around or we stand at the exit gates or something like that and we hand out the survey in paper. So this is like the easiest way to basically approach people and say, hey, can you fill out the survey for me, right? But that of course doesn't work in an online event. One of the things that we like to do is we like to do post-event surveys. So what that means is after the thing has ended, we want to gather some information about, how people like the event, how they perceive the way that they work together, these kinds of things. We found that one good way of deploying surveys there is to have that in a time when they are still there, so when they're still at the event, technically participating, but when they have free time. And that in a hackathon is very sort of natural in the sense that at the end, typically you submit something and then there's a judging process. So you submit your project, and then there are people looking at it, and then you're basically waiting, did I win any of the awards, or I don't know, how did I score, stuff like that. And this time we typically utilize in order to send out surveys or in order to show it in the live stream or something like that and say, hey, here's a QR code, or we send it through parallel channels. Like, for example, oftentimes hackathons deploy Discord servers or Slack groups or something like that. So we can also send it out through that. So very different ways. I think the key really is that you get the people close to the event or close to what you actually want to measure, because otherwise they forget. Or if you just receive an email in your inbox next day, what happens? I mean, you look at it and then you have 10 other emails. So you think about, okay, which one do I really want to answer? And then it's not going to happen. So I think like proximity to what you want to measure is key, which in our case is very natural because it's an event. And the other thing is also to give them some time to do it while they're still there. So that's basically the strategies that we oftentimes employ. Of course, this doesn't really work always, because sometimes you have, I don't know, let's say you want to survey an event that you didn't participate in, or that you don't have access to, like through the organizer or something like that, and you still want to send out the survey. Of course, you can't do that strategy and be like, okay, here at the end of the event, please hand out the survey, right? So then you have to find other ways of doing it.
Well, it would be nice if everyone participated in the survey who was at the hackathon, but I think listeners will intuitively know that simply isn't going to happen. What is a realistic response rate?
That is really, really very different. I mean, so if you just send out a survey to a random group of people, let's say, I don't know, I want to survey everyone that has committed to a certain repository in GitHub or something like that, which
Hmm.
is a sort of common, survey thing that people do. There you can expect a response rate below 5%. If you are there in person, and if you can hand out the surveys at the end of the event, well,
Yeah.
if you catch everyone, you can expect 40%, 60%, something like that, right? So it really depends a lot on how the access is that you have to people. And it also really depends on whether or not you find the people at the right time to,
Yeah.
do this.
Well, if you've conducted an online event, I guess you could focus on the timing, like should you follow up in 24 or 48 hours or something like that. But you're also limited in the impersonalness of an email that can easily be lost. So I imagine there are some ways to delicately craft that email to hopefully increase your response rate. Could you share some of your theories on this?
Oh, well, I mean, it's not only my theories. There's tons of work that actually has considered, thinking about what does the invitation, or what should the invitation actually looks like.
Hmm.
And there are very, very many like different approaches that people discuss and even conversely discuss. So, for example, some people say, oh, you should definitely send something like a picture. Other people say, no, don't do that. People won't respond to this, right? So I don't even think there is any agreement.
Mm.
But the typical things that you want to do is if you can address people by name. So if you can say, hi, Kyle, instead of hi, participant of event number 23 that you participated in 2 months ago,
Hmm.
right? That definitely helps. The other thing that helps is to give them a realistic time estimate, because people want to know, okay, so, how much time do I actually have to invest in this thing in order to complete it. That's
Yeah.
definitely a thing that is happening. What also helps is if you give people information about where you actually got their contact from, because like if you just get a random email from some random person, then you're just going to be like, okay, so why did they write to me again, and how am I connected to this? But if you can say, okay, so this was because you participated in this event and I've been helping to organize this event, or I don't know, I was a mentor at this event or something like that, that typically also helps. So there are very many different things that you can do, and some of them are even also sort of predicated by stuff like IRB. There are things that you need to tell people in order to survey them. Like, for example, what are you going to do with their data? What
Mhm.
kind of questions are you going to ask and things like that? Because they need to consent. On the one hand, you want as many people as possible that are in your target population to answer the survey, but on the other hand, you also need to disclose what you're going to do in order to, get their consent to actually participate.
Well, the paper's main phrase that you use to describe some of these is the causal effectiveness trigger. Could you give us a quick definition of what a CAT is?
So, first of all, it's a casual affective trigger.
Sorry, thank you.
So no cause involved, zero cause involved, right? So the two key things here is really the casual thing, right? So it should be something that's like, I don't know, a thing that you see and immediately sort of evokes a reaction on your part,
Hmm.
which is then the effective part. So what we want to do is we want to show you something that you're going to be triggered by at best with a positive response and be like, oh yeah, I really want to, participate in this survey. Because the other thing that we didn't talk about yet, but that definitely is also corroborated by other research, is that people only spend a minimal amount of time looking at this. So if you write a 2 or 3 page email, they really look at it for, I don't know, literally seconds, like not even seconds, split seconds. So you need to grab their attention immediately. So that's why we thought, okay, having an effective trigger, so something that triggers positive emotions somehow, might help to entice people to participate in surveys.
And could you give an example of the particular ones you included in this research?
Okay, there's also a pun in term. You already
Uh-huh.
sort of pointed towards that, right? So Casual Affective Triggers, short CAT. The whole thing came from actually our cat. So one of the triggers that we utilized was a picture of a cat.
A feline.
Yeah, exactly. So cat in this case has very many different meanings. In fact, the way how this all came together is I was preparing for another survey of a big hackathon event that I wanted to study. And I talked to my colleague, and I was like, "This is great. I'm spending all this time and trying to prepare all this instrumentation, and then I know that no one's going to answer it anyway, right?" So there's also a level of frustration involved with this. And then she was like, "Yeah, why don't we try to spice it up a little bit?" And that's how, through discussions, we sort of came up with, "Okay, why don't we send a picture of a cat?" And yeah, that's how basically the whole thing evolved from there.
And does the cat have any relationship to the contents of the survey, or is it purely window dressing?
No, it has no. I mean, in this case, or that's also it was also rather on purpose because we wanted to find something that everyone can use. So if you want to, for example, for your podcast, if you send out the surveys,
Hmm.
if you want to use that, you can use that. It doesn't have to be connected at all. That's why it's not about am I connected to this event or am I connected to the content of the survey. It's really about affection, and this affection at best at yeah, I really like this cat picture, so I will participate in the survey. I don't really care what it is about. I would just participate.
Well, then, you send an email, you could perhaps be monitoring the rate at which people open it, but then they click the survey. That's an event, and hopefully, most of them complete the survey. You've got a couple of different milestones, which are critical to your analysis.
So we looked at basically two different aspects. One is, as you said, people look at it and then they close it, which is helpful or not. What we looked at is basically two different things. One is completed participation. So someone went through the entire survey and finished it. Oh, I should mention that most of the questions in the surveys that I generally send out, and in this case it was the same, are questions that you don't have to answer. So you don't have to provide an answer to anything. You can just click through. The only questions where we force people to answer is things that are built in the survey logic. So, for example, at the beginning, you need to accept the conditions under which the survey
Hmm.
is purveyed to you, right? So you need to say, okay, I understand what I'm doing here. I'm at least 18 years old, and I agree to participate. So that is a question that you need to answer. But everything else is really you can participate or not. You can just leave it open. So we looked at complete participation and we looked at partial participation. Partial participation in this case meaning that they started the survey but never finished it.
And let's start with the partial completes, or the people who started the survey. How do your cats impact those measurements?
So the odds of responding to a personalized invitation were 77% higher than the odds of responding to a non-personalized invitation. And with the cat picture, it was 42% higher than without the cat picture. So I would say it's quite significant. Saying that, very well knowing that we still only had a participation percentage of 4%, right? So
Hmm.
the 72% got you like so if you start with 3%, then you get 4%, right? Just to get this sort of into connection.
Yeah, but you started from a population, I think, in the 4 to 5,000 range. So even 4% can be a reasonable subpopulation, I would think.
I mean that of course depends on how large your survey is and what you want to do in the end with the data, how many people you actually need. But for us, it was definitely sufficient in the end. But yeah, you're right. If you have 4,500 people, then 1% difference might make the difference between this is very well usable for the study that you want to do or it's not usable.
So I recall the 2 by 2 you described, where participants can fit into kind of one of four categories, may have one or both treatments.
Right.
How do you look at it from an analytical perspective and break down and come to conclusions? What sort of techniques do you use?
So we did a regression analysis for this, and we basically checked the effect of the different conditions on the participation rate. And we basically used that to see, okay, is there a connection or is there not a connection? We found a statistically significant connection for these two different separate conditions.
And when you have the interaction, maybe I was one who got the personalized message with my name that sounds like we had a positive effect, and I also got the cat. Could those be additive in some way?
Yeah, so this is actually interesting. So we didn't find an additive effect. We only found the singular effects. We try our hands a little bit at some explanation in the paper, but we don't really have like hard data to underpin this. This would be subject to another study. But assumptions could be, for example, that these two things trigger basically very different kinds of affect. So it could be that the cat picture triggers a certain kind of affect and that the personal salutation triggers a certain other kind of affect. This has been seen in other studies as well, where some people react stronger to pictures and other people react stronger to, I don't know, like written statements and stuff, right? So there might be something there, but we don't really have the data to back up these different. So we don't really know why this was the case.
Well, I find cats to be pretty cute, especially I think it's yours that appears in the paper. Maybe I see a cat and it puts me in a good mood. Could that then bias my survey results?
Right. So in order to do that, of course, we also checked if the responses somehow are different. So we looked at the different responses that we got from these groups and we ran an ANOVA and we were trying to figure out is there a statistically significant difference between those, and there was none. So we can basically, with sort of semi-certainty, say that the cat picture will not statistically significantly bias the survey results, which is, I think, one of the more impressive findings of the paper.
Hmm.
Because one of the things that you oftentimes read is, for example, people have tried with other incentives to incentivize people to participate, like let's say monetary incentives, or I
Hmm.
don't know, you participate in a raffle, or I don't know, you get an Amazon gift card, stuff like that. And research on that finds that this oftentimes like impacts the responses that you get, which is of course as a researcher something that you don't want. So you want, of course, you want responses, but you want responses that you can use afterwards.
Right.
So in that case, that was actually one of the more interesting findings, I think, of this paper, is that we didn't find any statistically significant differences between the different experiment conditions.
So for the cat, it seems straightforward. I guess with the use of my name, maybe if I got Dear Participant, I would feel a bit more anonymous and maybe share different thoughts. Did you see that at all?
No, so we checked it for all the different conditions that we
Hmm.
sent. So the ones that I described, right? No name, no picture, name, just picture, both picture and name, and we didn't find any difference in either of those things. So there was none.
Well, if you're getting better response rates with these effects in there, and it doesn't seem that they bias the survey results, the natural conclusion might be to always put a cat and always use a personalization. What are your thoughts?
Of course, this is a study of one point in time. We did this once, we ran the analysis, and we did this one survey. Of course, what you might have is you might have a fatigue effect in the end. So if everyone does it, then everyone is so used to seeing it that it might not have an effect anymore. This is, of course, not something that we can really tell from this one study. That is something that we need to find over time. But there are definitely reports on other kinds of effects where they have shown that, there is a certain level of, you get used to what you're seeing, and so people are not responding anymore. Or they're not responding to that particular treatment. But then also, I mean, we tried two things. We started this whole interview with the concept of affective triggers. These are just two examples. I mean, you can let your imagination run wild, whatever other effective triggers you want to try out. It might be, okay, we don't take a cat picture, we take a dog picture. Or I don't know, you have a chime or some music, or like whatever it might be, anything that can trigger sort of a positive casual emotion towards the person that is sending you this email could help in any case. Of course, we can't say because we didn't try this out, but this was an experiment with two different types of effective triggers. Other ones might as well be feasible or not. We don't know.
Do you face any engineering challenges in setting something like this up? I'm not aware of an easy way to split the emails out in quite that way and link it to the survey and all those sorts of details.
I mean, for this experiment, what we did is we had the population ready in like a CSV type file where we had the names and the email addresses, and we knew that they all participated in the same event, and we just split it randomly. And we just said, okay, for this person receives that email, this person receives that email, and in the back end, it was really just a Python script. So we had two different texts. One with, at the end it says, I would something along the lines like, I would appreciate if you participate in the survey, and no picture. And then the second one is, me and my cat would appreciate if you would participate in the survey, and the cat picture. So that was the one thing. And the other thing was really just a matter of, if there was a name in the CSV attached to it, then you would put the name. Otherwise, you would say, dear participant of event, whatever, because they were all from the same event, right? So we didn't need to distinguish between those types of things either.
Well, I know this paper I invited you to come on and talk about is really focused on, I guess, these cats and how they can influence the response rate. But I'm also curious about the hackathon itself. What sorts of things do you want to learn from that population?
My work on this is really has started sort of with participating in events like that and feeling that this is a cool atmosphere. It's a nice place to be. You meet interesting people, you do cool stuff because you work on projects that you're interested in. But then oftentimes it stays like that. So you just go there, you participate in the event, and then that's it. And I always felt that's kind of a shame because I thought, okay, all these people spend all their time to go there to participate. Shouldn't we do something with it? So my interest in these events really started from, can we do something in order to understand, number one, what happens after a hackathon has actually ended? And number two, is there any way that we can maybe at least entice the people that are interested to continue? And can we give them resources to continue afterwards? Because I also understand that oftentimes people just go to these events because, I don't know, a friend takes them,
Hmm.
or because there's free pizza, or because, I don't know, I want to win a new Bose headset or whatever, right? So there might be things that have nothing to do with whatever you did at the hackathon. It's just oh, it's a cool thing. Let's just go. Let's see what happens. If we like it, we stay. If we don't, then we disappear. But I felt there is a way that we could try to better understand what happens during these events and what sort of fosters continuation activity and what doesn't.
Well, I know from looking at your Google Scholar page, hackathons are a big part of your research work. Can you speak to some of the other areas beyond the survey design that are novel for studying this phenomenon?
One of the things that we're currently moving towards is more trying to understand the sort of networking and the more like human effects of hackathons. Because what we have done a lot, and that's also what you would see in our Google Scholar or in my Google Scholar profile, is that we've focused very much on what the people did during these events. So we looked very much at what happened to these projects, what happened to the software code that was developed, how does code get developed during these events, that kind of stuff. But I think the more you start working on that, you realize that it's an opportunity for people to also get to know each other and to start collaborations that might not have anything to do with what they actually did there. It's just, hey, I met Kyle. I know now that he knows about certain things, and this is something that I might be able to use for something else. Or I just like Kyle, so let's just hang out together and see what happens. So we are now starting to look more at what happens on a more human level. That's sort of one direction. The other direction that is very closely connected actually to the survey part that we discussed before. It's very hard to study these events, especially when they are in person, but also when they are online, in terms of actually understanding what goes on. Even when they are online, you typically have this thing that they send out a Discord server invite and everyone is supposed to be there. And then, they form teams there and then the people are supposed to communicate there. So you would think that you have a ton of information available about, what happens during an event and how people communicate and what they do and stuff like that. Well, it turns out this is, of course, not the case because people go to this Discord server or to this Slack thing or whatever, and they just take the information that they receive from the organizers and just use that for communication with the organizers. And for themselves, they go to, I don't know, a Facebook group, or they, I don't know, exchange phone numbers and use WhatsApp or whatever. So in the end, you don't really have traces available either. So what we are currently working on is instrumentation that we can at least trace people that are participating in an event so that we can see, okay, Kyle stood together for a certain period of time with these people. Kyle interacted with a mentor and stuff like that. And what we're trying to figure out is there a way of using this data to understand what's going on at an event? Because just because you stood next to each other doesn't really mean much, right? It could be like, I don't know, we were waiting together for the coffee or whatever, right?
Hmm. When I was in university, I either missed the opportunity or didn't have the opportunity to participate in any hackathons. There just didn't seem to be any around. And I guess I did okay. Everything worked out, but it does seem like it should be a component in a lot of people's educations. Do you have any thoughts on how prominent of a component or what role it should play in education?
They are a great vehicle for people to try out and sort of further develop skills. So I don't think there is any point of starting a course and immediately doing a hackathon when you have never learned how to, I don't know, use Python or whatever like programming language you might want to use, right? So it's not for that kind of stuff. What I think it is great for, it is great for if you have learned the basics and if you want to apply them in a real project, because one advantage is you can work on something that's interesting to you. How often does that happen? Right? I mean, oftentimes you just said in university, oftentimes you get a project that you're supposed to do, or I don't know, someone else decides for the project. Here you can work on something that you're interested in, and you can sort of hone these skills. But in addition to that, it's also that no one works alone anymore after they leave university. It doesn't happen.
Right.
So you have to work together if you want to achieve something during a hackathon. So I also think communication and collaboration skills is something that you're definitely going to develop during an event like that. So I think it's a great thing that you can introduce or include into your course when you think, okay, there's a practical thing that I want people to do. Then I think it's a great format for that.
Well, Alexander, I'm curious if you can tell us a little bit about where your research is going next.
So, I mean, I talked about that a little bit
Hmm.
already, right? So one of the things that's definitely going towards is something that we probably a little bit, over the top currently call collaboration analytics. So it goes towards trying to understand, how can we from traces understand how people work together? And the other thing is definitely this sort of more human component of hackathons. So what impact does it really have on a networking perspective or on, how people collaborate after an event has ended? The other thing that I should also mention is we started with in person events.
Hmm.
Hackathons were always this let's all come together in one room or in one space and do something together. And then the global pandemic happened, and I thought, oh, great, now I have to find a new research area because we're not meeting anymore, so that's not going to work. But what turned out to happen was that all the events moved online, and I'm not saying that they were the same, right? But they were functional.
Hmm.
Something was happening. People still went. People still enjoyed them. Maybe in a different way, but there was still something happening. So what is going on now is, of course, that people are thinking about more hybrid settings. So where you have an in-person component, we have an online component. Because the clear advantage of online is that people can participate even if for some reason, for example, they're not able to travel. And that might include I don't have the money to go, I have other commitments around the event, I can't obtain a visa, stuff
Hmm.
like that. So you would expect that this kind of thing sort of serves towards a more broader participation, which is definitely something that you want. And then the other thing is also you don't have so many space constraints anymore, right? So you can have more people at your event technically, but then the thing that happens is that I don't know in how many hybrid events you have participated so far, but we are really not good at this yet.
Yeah. No, I think it's
Is
it's been one or the other. I haven't been somewhere and participated in a online experience at the same time. It was more like people lurked on the online portion.
I think there's a lot to learn and there's a lot to develop, and that is definitely also something that I'm very much interested in because again, I perceive hackathons to be great spaces for learning, for developing something, for getting to know people. But I also think that this traveling everywhere is not really sustainable, both from a traveling money visa perspective, but also you want to think about your carbon footprint that you leave in the end.
Hmm.
So having this online option is definitely great. But then, of course, you want to do it in a way that is actually feasible, that doesn't treat online participants like second class citizens, which is what is probably often happening. I mean, from the experience of the not hackathons but sort of hybrid events that I participated in. It's oftentimes you are there, but you're not really there.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be developed and there's a lot to be understood that we can still do, and that's something that's exciting.
Yeah. I look forward to seeing improvements in this space for all the reasons you gave. Yeah. More events like this, and we're a very connected world. There's no reason we all have to be there.
Right, that is true, definitely.
Well, Alexander, is there anywhere people can follow you online?
I have a Twitter profile which I don't use that much anymore, but you can find me on LinkedIn. I have a website, Alexander Nolte at github.io. There you can find all my contact information. So please feel free to reach out, look at it. The other thing that I also wanted to say is if you are ever planning to run a hackathon, or if you're interested in, understanding more about the space, we have a website that's called the Hackathon Planning Kit. It's hackathon-planning-kit.org. And there you will find a ton of resources for organizers to think about how can I organize an event, and you will also find the publications that we have about this contact information, all sorts of things.
We'll have links to all those in the show notes for listeners to follow up.
Perfect.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your work.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, that's it for today's episode. I would be forever grateful if you would check in about once a week to survey.dataskeptic.com. We're launching regular new surveys there, and your opinion matters. You can see the results first before they appear here on the show. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and for listening. Until next time, everybody.